Welcome to At Least You Heard It Here, with your host, former federal prosecutor, Alyse Adamson. Take it away, Alyse.
Welcome to another episode of At Least You Heard It Here. I'm your host, Alyse Adamson. And this is the podcast where we put the topic of the day on trial. And today's topic is the Department of Education. More specifically, the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle that department. And I'm so pleased to be joined by my inaugural guest and friend, Nick Zaveri. Nick is a communications graduate from Rutgers University and Connecticut School of Broadcasting. He did a brief stint in local radio in New Jersey. And he's now works in the field of education as a teacher and an instructional coach, which he's been doing for over 20 years. So he is the perfect person to come on and discuss. And he's also the co-host of a wonderful podcast called Can We Please Talk? If you have not already checked it out, please hop over there after this. Go ahead and subscribe. And he also drops into Educate U.S, another podcast, all on the Leon Media Network. So make sure you go and check those out after our discussion today. So welcome, Nick. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's funny, before you hit record, we were talking about which bio to use. I had forgotten the professional parts on the bio. So the part about being a educator and instructional coach, what is still true up until 2024 or last year. I've now moved into higher education. So it's interesting to talk about education now as it relates to the Trump administration, especially in the higher ed world. I work as a recruiter, do a little bit of academic counseling for students. I enroll for a college that's based out in the West Coast. So I don't name the college, but I'll tell you after the show where it is. But yeah, no, add all that to now, getting a chance to work with professional students in the beyond the K-12 world. So really interesting time to have perspective on education matters from the littlest of the little ones all the way to now our college graduates.
Yeah, I can imagine. And speaking of that, I think, you're obviously well-versed in all of this. As you just said, you're now in higher education, having been primary and secondary education. So you've seen it all. But I think, at least for me, and I think for, the average American, we don't really have a good grasp on the educational system here in the United States, and especially with respect to the Department of Education. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what the Department of Education is. What was its primary purpose, its intended purpose, and what is its impact?
Well, the Department of Education had only really been around since the 70s. It's really an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. The ability to ensure that what had come out of the civil rights movement was going to live in the education space as well, which in many ways is probably why conservatives have had such an issue with it. The idea of institutionalizing civil rights as an area of focus in K-12 education, or even through higher education, I guess. So it always lived. That was sort of the legacy of it. But really what the Department of Education comes down to is a couple of things. One is funding. Everything, when we talk about funding, specifically, for example, for students that have special needs, that determination of funding is coming at the federal level. If you've ever been in a school where you've heard funding sources such as Title I or Title II or Title III and so on, that's all federal money. The determination of those titles and those funding sources were all, again, outgrowths of the civil rights movement, or the civil rights bill, or civil rights law, rather. So we're seeing the Department of Education really focusing on there. What you probably have not heard me say, I know you haven't said it because I haven't said it, is curriculum. What the Trump administration and many conservatives like to really associate with the Department of Education is the idea that as a federal entity, it has an influence on what is being taught in schools. That's flatly not true. I often like to start in a place of what it's not, and what it's not is the arbiter about curriculum. So when you hear conservatives attack public schools as being places of indoctrination and forced liberal thinking, that's really not true. That's really to the discretion of teachers, honestly. And you're hearing this from someone who has worked with schools in New York City and also in the South in areas of Arkansas and Tennessee. So I've seen teachers of all political persuasions, and what their dictate is coming on down from their principal, saying that there's a certain expectation of what to say. What is dictated often is pedagogy in terms of how you're teaching students, and also curriculum as it relates to, well, how are we going to teach these areas of math and reading? Whether or not we're going to talk about areas of racism and sexism and all forms of bias, again, many times that can be at the teacher's discretion. You may have school districts sometimes that in the past had made efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's a way of saying that we're going to create an environment where we are paying tribute to these ideas, these very important ideas. But what it was never about telling people, particularly white students, that there's something wrong with you, that you're bad, blah, blah, blah. These are all scare tactics that conservatives have liked to use lately in demonizing education.
That's so interesting. And I want to start with the legacy of the civil rights movement, which you said is kind of baked into the Department of Education. It was one of the drivers for its creation. What were the social ills, or what were the problems that this department was kind of imagined and designed to either prevent or to make right? Just for context, because a lot of people understand the civil rights movement, and of course, obviously, as a person of color, it's an important moment in history where everybody gained their rights and access to equal education. Is that really what it was? Was it just a way to make sure and to federalize this equal access, which was now, by Supreme Court mandate, essentially the norm, the law of the land? Is that what happened?
Essentially, yes. So we think of the Department of Education essentially as being a structure built to carry out the mandates of the Civil Rights Act in reference to schools. The belief being that even with the decision of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, you can have that. But remember that only a few years later, in 1957, you still had to have federal troops going to, I think it was Little Rock, Arkansas, under the Eisenhower administration, to force integration, or to force states to recognize integration. The Department of Education was essentially created as a structure to make sure that these mandates that were being established from the Civil Rights Act were going to be actually in place. Otherwise, you would have to have a president or anyone at the federal level basically finding ways, similar to Eisenhower, to mandate these what was being determined in terms of integration, essentially separate but equal, the doctrine ending essentially with the Brown versus Board decision. So it was essentially a federal arm to ensure that those regulations were being met. At the same time, too, you have to also remember that we're also thinking of, and this is in a form of inclusivity, we're recognizing that students with special needs have to have certain materials available to them. We have to make sure that, based on their educational needs, that we're doing something to meet those needs. Couple that also with recognizing students that were members of families that were below the poverty line. So when we're thinking about the idea of free and reduced lunch, making sure that's in place was something that the Department of Education helped to do. As a result, from then to, most recently with the Trump administration, it was essentially, at best, I would consider an arm of maintaining the critical pieces of the Civil Rights Act in educational settings.
So interesting, because as you also noted, the talking points, the narrative right now, that's advancing the idea of why it's important to dismantle this dangerous department, right? It is based on curriculum. At least that's what you're hearing in a lot of these, far right media outlets, or however they're advancing their agenda. They're saying they are teaching woke theory, right? They're teaching this critical race theory, as you noted, that it makes white students feel ashamed, for instance. But what I heard you say is the Department of Education is not responsible for the curriculum. They're not mandating that any of this be taught. Is that correct?
It is. As I was mentioning earlier, if we're looking at, curriculum developed at the federal level, the most recent version of this was what we considered the Common Core. But even in those standards, which were focusing on reading for literature, reading for nonfictional text, and mathematics and writing as well, none of that really talks about culture. So there's really no space that's talking about the mandates of having conversations about racism and bringing up the importance of understanding the legacy of racism and sexism in this country. Now, having said all this, at the local level, this is where states and districts could make their own decisions about this. So if you happen to be in a school district that you find to be woke, or whatever we want to call it now, it begs the question of what exactly are people concerned about? It's funny because, and I have a copy of it, pretty much over my shoulder, of the 1619 Project. So, you have Nicole Hannah, I think Nicole Hannah Jones had been the author. Also a podcast series from the New York Times. And it was groundbreaking content. I mean, it put forward the idea that slavery is not something that, we basically buttoned up post-Civil War. There's a legacy to it. It's not a small coincidence that shortly after that book, and then you have a show like Watchmen on HBO that talks about the Tulsa race riots. In the United States, some of these areas of American history that had basically been kept under lock and key for years was starting to come to the surface. And think about it this way. Prior to the release of the 1619 Project, while there have been efforts by Republicans to try to remove the Department of Education, it really wasn't to the point where it was such a constant talking point from the conservative media outlets, conservative candidates. It really wasn't there. But then this book comes out along with that podcast series and a series of articles by the New York Times that put front and center the legacy of slavery. And then suddenly conservatives became nervous because we're talking about an area of American history that some people are very uncomfortable discussing, but it's still undeniable.
Everybody wants cheap airfare, but where do you find it? You call Low Cost Airlines. They specialize in cheap flights, discount hotel rooms, cheap car rental rates, and with a best price guarantee. If you want the lowest prices on your airline tickets or other travel services, call now. That's right, call. That's the only way to get these rates. Experts are standing by 24/7 to get you the cheapest airfare and hotel rates available. So don't wait. Call now.
And we saw this actually most recently with Florida. Florida had started to change their history standards. There was a line about essentially, I'm being simplistic here, but it talked about trying to explain that slavery was a job or that slaves had jobs. No, sorry. It was something about slaves learning about marketable skills that they could use, when they were freed.
I mean, all of that sounds ridiculous. I mean, I know you were trying to get it right, but enslaved people were enslaved and what they were doing was slave labor. So there is no narrative. And it's also interesting to hear, these people's viewpoints, because this doesn't seem like an ideology to me. This is just facts. This is factual. There was slavery in this country for hundreds of years, and there were millions of people who were enslaved as a result. That's not an ideology. Those are facts. Those same folks were ultimately, freed, but now there is a legacy of slavery that persists to this day. That is also a fact. That is not an ideology. So it's very interesting to hear you say that a lot of this blowback to the Department of Education is a result of just bringing to the forefront of the American consciousness something that has already been true. It is also interesting, if I'm understanding you correctly, that what has been brought to the forefront isn't even something that the Department of Education is responsible in the first place. It really is local. And you hear a lot, and we're going to get into this in a few minutes when we talk about kind of the talking points and what the conservatives want to see happen. They say, let's bring education to a local level. Well, if that's the case, obviously there's going to be local education systems that are still committed to teaching what I would submit to you is just facts. But understanding all of that, so what is the Trump administration doing? He's issued a slew of executive orders, and I'm not connecting how these executive orders are going to essentially suppress what the conservatives see as dangerous and divisive ideology in these schools. So can you just talk a little bit about those EOs and what the practical effects of those EOs are on the Department of Education and education more broadly?
Yeah, I think the answer or the rebuttal is going to live in the advent of the internet. I'll use a very simple example, but the story of Buddha is based partly in the idea that you have an Indian prince whose father tries to shield him from life outside the palace, which is of course homeless people and suffering, and people who are not as privileged as the royal family. And eventually the prince gets out one day and sees human suffering, and it dawns on him that is this part of our existence, and completely reframes his thinking. And again, overly simplistic version of the origins of Buddhism. But the idea of the father, though, trying to create a structure that denies reality to someone.
Yeah.
That, in essence, is what the Trump administration is trying to do. See, because conversely, when you talk about if we're trying to bring up any form of ideological arguments being made, up until I guess recently with what the Trump administration is trying to say, it's hard to point to it, because if you're talking about the legacy of slavery, there's no way to deny it. In fact, actually, early on, for Can We Please Talk, maybe our second year, one of the people we had on was Professor Eric Foner at Columbia University, who's probably the foremost expert on Reconstruction, which is that period post-Civil War, 1865, till about almost like turn of the century, like Teddy Roosevelt's administration.
It's a fascinating time that I don't think enough people know about, because they made fantastic inroads to progress, which were then undone, correct?
There's a missing 35 years of American history, and there's a really good reason why. Now, actually, it's also behind me too. But Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, we had 8 Years in Power, which is a collection of essays. But one of the essays there talks about that there's this period after the Civil War where you had African Americans that were starting to serve in public service positions, that were elected positions. There was a rise in power, and there was an immediate blowback to that, what could best be considered a white lash. And essentially, the removal of all that, culminating in events like we see in Tulsa. Now, again, as I share that story, we don't think about that. We fast forward from the end of the Civil War through Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Act. Well, a lot happens along the way there. And the point being that at least Coates' book talks about, and many others have talked about this too, is that there was a period that immediately after the ending of slavery that African Americans were finding opportunities to further progress themselves in society. But then something happened. And that something is what is often trying to be downplayed currently by conservatives. Having said all of this, what the Trump administration's argument is about trying to localize education, it's a little silly in the sense that that's always been a localized matter. For me right now, I currently live in Pennsylvania. I live on the eastern side of the state. We have a school board. We have a school district. As parents, we all have the ability to participate in those school board meetings. We can all be vocal and take a role. At the same time, as parents, we also have the opportunity to be involved in the education of our children. When my daughter comes home from school, because my oldest is in 4th grade and my youngest goes to kindergarten this fall, the education doesn't stop there. We have, as parents, the opportunity to have a conversation with our child about sharing what our own collective wisdom is, our own knowledge. Obviously, with this, library behind me, there's plenty of text I'll sometimes introduce to her. And, at some point I'll probably make her read some of it. But, I have a role to play in the education of my daughter. Now, that also comes from the fact of being someone who's done some reading, as my wife has as well. So we can actively play a role. So when the president tries to spin a story as though the Department of Education, the school district, is the sole arbiter or the sole infuser of learning into our child's brain, that's simply wrong. And again, where I wish people would do some more thinking on this is to understand that parents do have a larger role to play. The idea of school choice is very much real. I mean, at any time. If you wish to just remove your child from a school, you can do so. Now, you obviously have to find a replacement to that, either homeschooling or private schooling, because there are laws about making sure that children attend some form of school. But that's always been in place. So when we talk about school choice as being something that's denied to families, that's simply a lie. What is different, though, and that's actually what's talked about now currently with this, the bill that's being going through the House, potentially $5 billion in school vouchers to families, that's starting to put some money behind this.
Well, I could see an argument that not all parents would take advantage of the money for homeschooling. They want to take the money and go to private school, for instance. What happens if they have schools they consider to be failing in their areas? And to your point about test scores going down, they want a better resourced school where their children can get that extra instruction that the parents cannot provide. And maybe school choice allows them to do that. And then with respect to homeschooling, I mean, the problem with COVID also was no one else was allowed in your house. So it was literally just you. I was flailing. I'm no teacher. I did a horrendous job, right? But isn't there an argument that with proper resources, you could do a proper homeschool where you're just not, dialing into a Zoom during the day, but you have the equipment and the materials to make sure that the children are being educated properly rather than flying by the seat of their pants like all of us were for those 2 years? I mean, what would you say to that?
No, I'd say it's the example of school choice that's always been there. That even prior to COVID, I mean, homeschooling was always an option. So when it's painted as though, there's a crisis at hand right now that we need to rectify, I think that's a little deceptive when it's being portrayed by conservatives. So, if I do believe in that concept of school choice because it's always been there. Yes, there are times where the school you are in, there's a general malaise of teachers because they're under-resourced, they're underpaid. They may not be the most excited about the work that they do. There are students who, for a variety of reasons, are struggling academically, and the school's under-resourced to provide those resources to those kids. So as a result, teachers, with a lack of support from guidance counselors or school counselors or additional academic interventions, the teacher has to play all those roles while being woefully underpaid and while, in many ways, being underprepared to do that. To the outsider, it's going to look like that's a struggling school. So what's to stop us from, the amount of money that basically goes to the student, because that's how school funding works, travels with the student to another institution. Makes total sense. The challenge there is at the macro level, and Texas is actually a really good example of this, because in Texas, you would have thought school choice would have been a given from years ago. Only recently is it gaining traction because there was a population in the state of Texas that was going to lose out. Rural schools. When you start to pull money away, what happens is if the only school you have within, say a 25-mile radius is just essentially what was a former farmhouse, and we all get it, but if you shut that down and you tell families, well, we're going to give you money, well, where am I going to put this? And I'm not prepared to homeschool my child. So where is the child going to go to school? And therein lies the real challenge of this is, do you run the situation of where you're providing money to families that the amount that families are getting, if that family is already above the poverty line and they're comfortable enough that money really does get them over the hump financially to enroll in a private school, fine. But what if it's not enough? That person's still going to be going to a school that we may consider an ineffective school, or worse, that school gets closed because there's not enough students going there. So now students lose that community school, but they can't afford the private school. Notice that the one thing that's being left out of the conversation is if you pull back this infrastructure of guaranteeing public education for everyone, do you run the risk of having students that really just don't have access? I mean, it's not the only time in America where we have created systems where people don't have access through intentional purposes. You may be doing that with children now. And if you do that, then the potential of generational harm that you're looking to create is going to be greatly exacerbated. Because as we talk about all this, I'm not hearing a lot about, are we going to continue to try to have something in place that says every child has access to a quality education?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that the likely impact of the dismantling of the Department of Education, which, by the way, is occurring through an executive order. The president has instructed Linda McMahon, name probably sounds familiar because she was head of the World Wrestling Entertainment for many years with her husband, Vince McMahon, but somehow is qualified to run the Department of Education, but to dismantle it. And of course, they can't shutter it completely unless it is authorized by Congress, because it is a congressionally created entity and there is supposedly a separation of power in this country. But it is happening. They're defunding it. They're trying to do everything they can to stop its agenda. So it's interesting that, to your point, the impact of that is going to be a lack of access, where now I understand from this conversation that the entire intent behind it was actually providing access. Now, to your specific question, what are they so afraid of? I really don't know. And I don't want to say all conservatives too. I want to be fair because, I know a lot of conservatives that are not all in on this plan, and they are not against public education. Maybe they want a little bit more school choice, but they're not the ones that are shaking in a corner, pointing the finger like the Salem witch trials and say, woke ideology, woke ideology. They're not all like that. I'd say it's far right. But what are they afraid of? I don't know. I want to hear your thoughts. I mean, perhaps an integrated school system, one where they are taught facts and they can't control it. And we're going to talk in a moment about what some of the demands on curriculum will be, or should, or the president said should be, which is teaching patriotism, which I don't know. I think that's code word for whitewashing history, from what I understand their concept of patriotism to be. But before we get into our mini trial, what do you think? What do you think they're so afraid of?
I think it is that. I think it's that public education has always been seen as a pillar of liberalism, from K-12 through higher education. So, I mean, perhaps maybe one of the greatest examples of this is the role of colleges and universities during the Vietnam War. We can think about the role of protests and an awareness of college students of protesting the draft and openly questioning the United States government. And ultimately, what really came to a head there is the shooting of students at Kent State, in 1972, I think. So ultimately, I mean, you had 4 students lose their lives because of essentially of a military action. You bring that down to the K-12 level, and the fear is that public education can be the one arm or the one entity that may be helping to develop a generation of people that doesn't believe everything that the government says, that is willing to actually want to help evolve and grow the country. Where better to do that is starting at the areas of, with children. I mean, an example of this is, when we talk about lack of civics education. I mean, the fact that you have many Americans right now that are comfortable with a president that essentially really wants to remove the power from Congress and be the sole decider of laws in this country, not unlike a king. And the fact that people are supportive of that should tell you that people really don't actually understand how our government works or what its intended purpose was. And you could argue that that's really coming from the fact that at some point we stopped teaching civics. We stopped teaching people intentionally how to get involved in their community. That was replaced with an emphasis on history. So let's think for a minute about, we want to talk about the lionization of our American heroes, our founding fathers, and the Union defeating the conservatives in the Civil War. We want to imbue facts and figures into students, but we don't want to talk about process. And what's more relevant to someone? Our first president and a story of a tree and whether he's honest about chopping it and also owning slaves, or how do you right now find out who your elected officials are? How do you go to their office? How do you demand or ask to have an audience to have your words be heard? How do you participate in town halls? How do you run for office? Those modern concepts were just starting to disappear. Well, that's not an accident. If you if you remove activism and you remove an emphasis to folks of how to get currently involved and replace it with storytelling, well, then you create a very passive audience. Then again, it's ironic because we hear conservatives talk about indoctrination, but it's a two-way street. If you're accusing public education of doing that right now, but instead you offer what you consider a corrective, well, isn't that the same thing? Most recently, the president asked that, or is now writing an executive order about returning Columbus Day to being Columbus Day. Because under the Biden administration, there was also the recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day. Now, what does that tell you? I mean, you have someone that, again, you and I both agree is a murderous individual who participated and advocated for the subjugation of Indigenous people because they simply stood in the way of land acquisition. We're going to name a day after this person, but we're not going to teach what the legacy of that person is.
Well, because it doesn't fit in with the narrative and the whole narrative of Columbus. I mean, I think it's to your point about indoctrination and essentially that being what the other side wants to do, because the entire story of Columbus is that, at least that is taught to school age children, is factually inaccurate, right? I mean, where he landed, what his mission was, how he approached the Indigenous people when he, quote unquote, discovered the Americas. All of it is narrative. All of it is story. It is not factually accurate. And you're right. What they want to advance is that simple story that tells a nice, clean version of the steps of the founding of what ultimately became the United States. And so I think that's a very good point. And, as a lawyer, I just want to go to the facts. I'm always, tell me the facts. But the facts are inconvenient sometimes. And to your point, the facts are also uncomfortable, because I don't think teaching a curriculum that acknowledges the historical brutality of slavery is indoctrination. That is factual. So I agree that it is alarming that what the administration claims is writing in a problem within school systems is actually creating the same problem, just with an alternative narrative. Except in my mind, one is based on facts and the other is based on really fantasy, right? The fantasy romanticized version of the founding of America and what America is. And listen, I love America. I just want to make very clear. I was a federal prosecutor for years. I defended the Constitution. But, America is imperfect. And that's one of the reasons I love it, because there is progress. And even with this imperfect history, I do believe the best in us and that we can come together as a nation. But to do that, I think you do have to understand your history and also, to your point, understand civics. I have been absolutely alarmed by how many people don't understand the Constitution, that we're in a constitutional republic. They don't know what that means. And so they don't understand why it is so important that our lawmakers and our executive adhere to our Constitution. They don't even know what's in it. When I was talking about due process, with all of these cases, I go on TV, I have these conversations. People didn't understand where due process came from, how it was interpreted, and that the Supreme Court had interpreted a certain way over and over again, and that Supreme Court's interpretations are binding. All of these principles I take for granted as a given because I've learned them, but I guess they're not teaching them. And people thought that, well, if 55% of the population think one thing, then the will of the people should prevail. And that's not what we live in a representative democracy. We don't live in a direct democracy. They don't get it. So I think all of those points that you've made are interesting, and tying it back to the U.S. educational system, because sometimes I just scratch my head and I think, how did we get here? And I think you've just provided a very solid explanation for how we got here, but it also kind of evinces why it's dangerous to continue on this path, right? Like, we need critical thought.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, and I use myself as a good example of sort of like that happy middle ground. I mean, I certainly am enthralled by the legacy of how the government was founded. Because, I mean, we can recognize that, it's a government that had representation solely by white men. At the same time, the design of the country by its laws sets the stage for the ability to have constant evolution. It's what the founding fathers had sort of talked about. There was no thought of this is ironclad and this is never going to change. Like the kind of mantra of someone like a Justice Scalia that sort of talked about it. I think, Scalia was sort of what's considered, I guess, a strict interpretationalist, but it was never meant to stay the way it was. Like it was built to have ways to continue to evolve and grow. Now, again, the people that were responsible for these initial documents are problematic people. But in my head, I can reconcile the merits of Thomas Jefferson alongside the evils of this person.
Well, Nick, my view is clear. Your view is clear. But I always challenge listeners to go and do their own research. To your point, it's the critical thinking. It's the research element that there is concern about, right? Like we all need to make sure that we have those skills to educate ourselves. And so that is the challenge for everyone today. I'll go ahead and drop some links to some primary reading sources if everybody is interested. And Nick, thank you so much. For all of you, if you liked what you heard today, go ahead and click subscribe. Join me next time. And remember to tell folks, at least you heard it here.